Today I will talk about the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, or as they sometimes called the Ranis, because it's way easier. A big thank you here to Naval Institute Press for providing a complimentary copy for content creation of the book Women at War, as it's linked in the description. And before we start with the regiment, it's very important, this regiment was part of the Indian National Army. Now the Indian National Army was in place from 1942 to 1945. It was created by the Japanese for basically propaganda causes, but for the Indians that served in there and that created it, it was their way to get independence from the United Kingdom, from the British Empire. Now, the size of the Indian National Army in general was about 40 to 50,000, and it consisted initially of prisoners of war, mainly those who surrendered and were fighting on the British side, and later on also civilians. Now, there is an article on it, and it's basically, since the symbol of the Indian National Army was a springing tiger, the author said, okay, it was basically a paper tiger, which is also due to the circumstances it was under. Because as the Japanese, they saw it as a propaganda cause, they didn't give them first-rate equipment, of course. They were hesitant with funding, and also Japanese logistics were rather, well, not so well developed, and they were okay for the Japanese because they were quite Spartan and everything, but not for anyone who was more into modern warfare and, of course, who were fighting before with the British Army, who had a better logistical system. So this should be taken in this context. Maybe I do a video on the Indian National Army beforehand, but in the future, but for now, that's about it. Now, back to the women's regiment. Now, the name was the Rani of Jhansi, was a rebel in 1857 and was a rebellion against the British. So this is the name given to the regiment about this, and usually they're called Ranis because, well, it's way easier. And now the source situation for this is quite complicated because the Indian National Army basically destroyed about 95% of all documents. So before they surrendered and everything, most of it was destroyed. So quite many information is based on interviews and also on interrogation reports the British did with the Indian National Army prisoners of war. And other aspects, for instance, the captain of the regiment, Lakshmi, she wrote quite several memoirs and everything, and the author always combines for instance, the information from the interview and with archive sources and with the memoirs and with other information from the time. Well, that's actually quite interesting if you read this book. For instance, when she tries to determine the size of the Rani regiment, and she says, okay, they all knew themselves by name, they told me, and if we look at the size of the camp, okay, the size can't be above this size, and it must be below this size or something along those lines. It's very interesting to read and actually see how she argues and determines that some information is incorrect or correct, or that the statements of one person, for instance, changed about the size of the regiment over the years. It increased over time, basically. So very interesting to read, especially if you're into oral history or also if you're interested in how the human memory works. Now, the regiment itself was created in 1943 in Singapore on the initiative of Subhas, Chandra, Bose. I hope I got that name right. And there were several Bose, I think at least the second one, which was important. So when I speak from Bose, I mean Subhas Chandra Bose in the future. And the size was initially, it's also debated, around 30 to 100 women, but it rose over the course of the war to around 450. Some claim it was larger, but from the arguments the author makes, I think it sounds pretty solid that it was around 450 and couldn't have been much more. And then initially, Bose had a female guard when he gave the speech, and there was several reactions on this. Some were quite shocked because females with weapons in India at this point, I mean, it was outside India, was out of the culture. Some were also positive reactions, and some called them like, okay, these are just decoration, and this is also just for propaganda. And this is the thing, for the Japanese, this was only about propaganda, whereas for the women in this regiment, it was quite different. So they were trained as combat troops for the most part, but it was seen as a political unit. And for instance, the view what Captain Lakshmi had and Bose was quite different. To quote now directly from the book, it is interesting to compare these differing versions of the RGR mission. Bose expected the all-male British Indian Army troops to defect to the Indian National Army, relieve the Ranis of the weapons and take over the fight. Captain Lakshmi's prospect was far less paternalistic. She foresaw that the regiment would continue to fight on the front line side by side together with the converted British Indian Army soldiers. As you can see, there was quite a difference on how they should have been deployed and how they were viewed. Now, basically there were two roles, nurses and soldiers. Both had to do physical training and also basic training, and there were around 300 trained to be fighters, to be combat units. Of course, the Japanese were quite dismissive about it, and they said this is a waste of money, and denied several times, for instance, property to set up the barracks and everything. And there was quite a counterclash, but at the same time, for instance, they also received quite a lot of preferential treatment from others. For instance, initially visiting relatives on Sunday was allowed, and when Bose found out, he actually said, okay, no more, like every other soldier as well. And they also got a special attention in many ways. For instance, there's this one very interesting aspect. It is striking that this level of attention during wartime was lavished on a 16-year-old, seemingly temperamental and unsubordinated soldier by her camp commandant, and even more remarkably by the supreme commander of the Indian National Army, for whom no detail of the RGR was too trivial for his personal attention. And additionally, they were well protected. There was usually a unit of men nearby for traveling and also for the camp to provide the protection. They were also then trained to provide camp security themselves. But for traveling, as far as I know, there was always at least a platoon of male soldiers around. And there's also the discussion about if they got better food or not. There's quite, I think this goes on for several pages, because some claim, yeah, they got, and some say, no, they didn't. At least the male soldiers usually had the perception that they got better food. Captain Lakshmi says, no, there wasn't. And some others state the other way around. So it's quite an issue. And then there's the issue, of course, of weapons, because this is really an interesting aspect. And I will now quote again from the book, because you can also see how the author actually looked up the data and then basically contradicts certain information that was given to her from memoirs or wherever she got the information from with actual facts, and say, okay, this doesn't add up. Now this is very interesting, and there's also a Canadian twist in it. Finding suitable guns for the Ranis was problematic. General Chatterjee, who was in charge of supplies for the Indian National Army, writes that the Lee-Enfield 303 rifles used by the male soldiers were too long and heavy for small South Indian women. Instead, according to Chatterjee, this problem was solved by issuing Canadian Ross or Dutch rifles to the RGR. The Canadian Ross was, however, known to be notoriously inefficient. In addition, the 52-inch Ross rifle is 8 inches longer than the Lee-Enfield 303, and at a weight of almost 9 pounds, it also 2 ounces heavier than the Lee-Enfield, and for those reasons Chatterjee's explanation is thus unconvincing. As you can see, it's quite complicated, and you must be quite distrustful of information people give you. And it's very important here, for those who don't know how the memory works, these people that gave that information that is wrong probably didn't lie. They really thought this was correct information. I had this several times experienced myself, that I gave information away which was wrong, which I later found out because I read up on it again. For instance, I think I was once very sure that I read book A before book B, and at one point I actually looked up my Amazon book lists when I bought them, and I realized no, I didn't, because I bought the one book before, and then I realized, okay, it's wrong. So memory, human memory is well, it's a bit buggy, let's call it this way. Now for training, they received physical training and also weapons trainings. They had training with the Sten gun, with the Bren machine gun, and also with various rifles. They were also educated in military history, on maps, geography. They also had night marches, and they had bayonet training, which all they noted that they really enjoyed the bayonet training, and they also had combat training with shooting. Although I don't know how far the combat training went into small unit coordination and everything, so that's not really mentioned, but it's also not in the focus of the book, and the question is if the information is even out there. Of course, there were several limits on this whole issue. No matter how well trained in camp the Ranis were and how many parade performances in the Pandang in Singapore they had given, it seems unlikely that teenage girls would have been able to haul 80 pounds of gear through knee-deep monsoon mud 25 miles a day, make safe drinking water, sleep in the open and live off the land, as was demanded of the men. They were never taught these skills. Now, as mentioned before, the views from the political side and the Ranis themselves was quite different on how they should act. And the Ranis were rather eager to fight and deploy. So they wanted to be deployed in the Burma campaign. But it never happened. Now, this is very important. Once the camp was bombed, but they never were close to the front nor saw combat at all. Later on, there were some claims that this happened, but basically they also looked at all the data and it's far away from the front line. Because the leadership had different intentions. It was not because it didn't want to, it was because, okay, the leadership said, no, this is not what should happen. The nursing section saw some action, not at the front line, and it was very praised. And again, a lot of myths around here, and this is always dangerous territory. So several pages basically is about the discussion about the numbers. And for those who want a final assessment about the regiment, I also quote now again directly from the book. Although they did not engage in combat against the enemy and their numbers were smaller than commonly believed, the Ranis were undoubtedly courageous individuals who broke ancient traditions by leaving home, training with the intention of entering into battle and dying for a country they had never seen. This sterling record needs no exaggeration. So well, I hope you liked this excursion into a rather different topic, and special thanks to Naval Institute Press here for providing a complimentary copy. And thank you for watching, and see you next time.